that even if you have zero interest in economics, you must have heard the term tariffs a lot recently, especially tariffs put on by Donald Trump. Incidentally, the US Supreme Court recently ruled that Trump's tariffs are illegal. Who the heck knows what that really means? Because Trump is doubling down and saying, that's fine, I'm going to increase the tariffs on everyone. What the heck are tariffs? Well, tariffs are really a tax. It's a tax we put on things that we buy from foreigners, things we import. And because it's a tax, it makes those things more expensive. Not surprisingly, Trump's tariffs have resulted in higher prices for US consumers. And yes, it is US consumers who are paying for these tariffs, not Chinese exporters. Typically, politicians say, well, tariffs are a way of dealing with trade deficits. We have trade deficits. We must do something about it. So we must put on tariffs. What is a trade deficit? Trade deficit simply means we are buying more from foreigners and we are not selling enough to them. So we have a deficit. We are buying more, not selling enough. This must be really bad. That's not the case, actually. This kind of thinking was prevalent 300 years ago. This is typically called mercantilist thinking, which says, you must sell a lot to others, don't buy enough. But over time, we understood that if other countries are better at doing certain things and they can do it cheaply, and it costs us a lot to make it within our country, then we are simply better off buying it from them. That makes perfect economic sense. If you can buy it cheaper from someone else, do it. Doesn't make sense for us to try and produce everything on our own. Moreover, often the cause of trade deficits lies in a completely different source. For instance, suppose lots of foreigners wish to invest in the market, in the US market. They need to buy US dollars in order to invest. Why invest? Because they think the US market is booming. I get a better return on my money if I invest in the US market. So to invest in the US market, I must buy dollars. If people demand dollars, that pushes up the price of the dollar, or what's typically called the exchange rate of the dollar against other currencies. So the US dollar starts becoming stronger. But look, when the US dollar becomes stronger, that also means that now US goods become more expensive to foreigners. So people who buy US goods now need to pay more. And so because of that, typically demand for US goods may fall. And by the same token, because the US dollar is now stronger, foreign goods, goods that the Americans buy from others, becomes cheaper. So the US imports go up. So notice what has happened here is US exports have fallen and US imports have gone up, a trade deficit. But this has nothing to do really with trade per se, just because a whole bunch of people really want to invest in the United States because they think the US economy is booming. So there is really no reason why you would need to impose tariffs to deal with something like this. So this whole process is driven by foreign investors investing in the US, and typically this actually increases US productivity and standards of living. Trade deficits can also arise if a country's citizens don't save enough. This is true of New Zealand. This is true of the US. So if you don't save enough, if your households, your consumers don't save enough to satisfy demand for investable money from businesses, then that gap must come from overseas. Overseas people must invest in your country. That sets off that same process. Demand for the currency goes up, the dollar becomes more expensive, and results in a trade deficit. So typically a country like the US, or New Zealand for that matter, that does not save enough to satisfy the demand for funds coming from businesses will always have a trade deficit. And countries like China, or say a country like China, which has a huge trade surplus, And that's because they save a lot, and so they send that money overseas to invest in other countries, and that will always result in a trade surplus. And tariffs really don't have much to do with any of these things.